discussed at this conference, and this is just to set the stage for what the status is in some of these major issues. I try to be balanced and cover all positions because I respect other brothers and sisters in Christ who we might disagree with one another, but hey, we better start getting along down here because we're going to have to get along for eternity. And a caveat here, I was asked to do this, I didn't volunteer. And honestly, there are others here today who are equally or better qualified to give this presentation than me. And so I also apologise if I'm not able to acknowledge everyone's work. Okay, so I can't mention all the people that are involved. You know who you are. So first of all, the geologic column, for want of a better way of putting it. I sometimes talk about the geologic record or the rock record because there is a physical rock record. And so I've defined it here, the physical observable rock record with its strata, sequence, and they contain fossils and not its millions of years. Okay, so when we talk about the geologic column, when we're discussing these issues amongst ourselves, we're talking about the physical rock layers that you can go observe and walk over and kick your toes on. So we're talking about that. Okay, sometimes we use the same terminology rather than new terms. The Cambrian, the Ordovician, we know what that means, but we reject this time scale. Okay, and so most of us agree that this is a general order with some exceptions. And the reason why we know it's a general order is because we can correlate these rock sequences around the globe. And Tim Clary has done that very eloquently, among others, because we find these stacked mega sequences or large sequences of layers that are separated by unconformities, that is erosion surfaces, and they can be traced across continents and correlated between continents. And so we've established that there is a global sedimentation pattern and it's consistent with the global flood cataclysm. And really when we look at it this way, I think we win the argument hands down. When you start with the scripture and you go and see what's out there, there is a physical rock column. Now we get into some of the controversial issues, and these are going to be discussed during this conference. There's a round table on Tuesday afternoon about these issues. The pre-flood boundary, where in the rock record, where's the physical boundary or level in the rock record where we observe the beginning of the physical evidence for the flood? And we find that most agree, not everyone, that this boundary is marked by a tectonic, that is an earth movement, erosional surface, paleontological boundary that can best be seen in the Grand Canyon at the Great Unconformity. And it marks the boundary between the Precambrian and the Cambrian, using the standard conventional terminology. And this has been well defined and it's well exposed in the Grand Canyon. You can go and put your hand on it and it's there. And it's a very marked erosional surface. For those of you who have been in the canyon, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Now, the interesting thing is this is even recognised by conventional geologists. And they are even recognising that this is a global erosion surface. And that's a huge admission that they've made in the last decade. That it represents not only a huge erosional surface, but the greatest known marine transgression. That is when the ocean waters flooded over the continents. Now, if ever that's a statement for the initiation of the flood, it's right there in the conventional literature. Now, and that boundary can be traced across the globe. Some geologists, flood geologists, want to place the boundary lower, and they have reasons for that, and that's fair enough if they want to discuss that. And they want to add some of the Precambrian sedimentary layers to the Grand Canyon, to the flood record. But most flood geologists, when they look at the fossils, realise you go in the Precambrian from microscopic fossils to the Cambrian where you get the megascopic fossils. And that's exactly why we put that boundary there. Many of us put that boundary there. But some have made a case for including some of the latest Precambrian, known in the geologic literature as the Neoproterozoic, including some of that in the flood, because you do get in some places, there are some variations in that boundary. So, as I said, you can trace this great unconformity right across North America. You can find it in North Africa, you can see it in southern Israel, and you can even see it in eastern China and South Korea. So it's well known, it's global. Okay, let's go to, I'm going the wrong way here, pressing the wrong buttons. Let's go to the flood, post-flood boundary. And we need to discuss these issues because this one particularly, where does the flood end in the record? After that, we've got to start thinking about animals migrating from the ark, people migrating from the ark, and so we geologists need to get our act together to sort this out, so the archaeologists and the biologists can do their bit in helping us understanding, particularly the early post-flood period of the migrations from the ark. And so we've got to determine where in the record is the physical evidence that we observe that shows that the flood ended. Now, there are two main competing views at the moment. There are other views, and that's fair enough too. But there are two main competing views that are strongly held by adherents. And that's because people have strong arguments and strong evidences. And I want to be fair in presenting this because those of you who are onlookers need to understand why this is so contentious, okay? First of all, there's the Cretaceous Paleogene, or the KT or the KPG boundary, that is, it used to be called the Tertiary, it's now called the Paleogene. The Tertiary's been divided into two. So there's that boundary, the end of the Cretaceous, the end of the Mesozoic, and then there is the Upper Neogene Pleistocene boundary. Some have a little bit of variation there exactly where it is, whether it's just before the Pleistocene or it's a little bit into the upper Neogene. But these are the two predominant views. And so you can see where they are on this diagram, roughly, where they sit. And also in this diagram here, when you look at the volume of strata, this is a representation of the volume of strata through the Paleozoic to Mesozoic, and then you've got the icing on the cake up there, so to speak, of the Paleogene and the Neogene. And so let's look at some of these. Well, first of all, a few still place the boundary lower in the record, and that will be discussed on Tuesday afternoon as well. So let's look at the KT boundary or the KPG boundary viewpoint. Okay? One of the arguments there is that mammals arose in the Paleogene as a result of migrating from the ark. The mammals are only found primarily in that, and you can actually find lineages from the fossils through to where the same animals are living today. For example, kangaroos in Australia, you find the fossils in Australia, you find the living kangaroos, but they're not the only examples. And I know people argue to and fro how that could be explained, but those who hold to the KPG position point directly to the fossil evidence as a strong argument for their case. And then also from the Paleogene upwards, we get sedimentation increasingly becomes continental and localised. And so you can recognise lake, fluvial and deltaic and aeolian sedimentation. So tomorrow afternoon in the East Genesis History Mountains after the flood, my friend John Whitmore will be talking about the Green River Formation as a lake deposition after the flood. And so that's another one of the arguments that is used. And there are no further marine deposits on the continents, major marine deposits. And so the ocean waters have drained off the continents. Now, of course, there are places in the Paleogene and Neogene where you do get some marine sedimentation. But we need to keep in mind, okay, that when Noah stepped off the ark, the present coastlines weren't necessarily established exactly where they were. Why did Noah stay in the mountains of Ararat and not go down to the plain of Shinar straight away? Maybe there was still floodwaters over the plain of Shinar, which produced the oil deposits in the Middle East in that period? I don't know. That's something we can discuss. But I'm just throw that out there to think about. And today's topography formed as the mountains had been uplifted and continental surfaces were eroded into. And of course, that's the subject of the documentary tomorrow afternoon. Now, in fairness, the Upper Neogene Paleocene boundary view has some very strong arguments and objections, and we need to consider those and discuss those. The Paleogene and later sedimentation is so extensive and thick that it would require conditions that were too catastrophic, and particularly emphasis on the too catastrophic. That's what those who hold that view argue. They also are concerned about continued plate movements with the earthquakes that would be involved and the heat from the new ocean floor, continuing accelerated nuclear decay as a consequence of that passage of time, and it would not be conducive to post-flood life, and that is a strong argument. And they would argue that the floodwaters were still draining off the continents into the still forming, cooling and sinking ocean basins. They point, as I said a moment ago, that the ocean water still covered the Middle East in the Paleogene and developed oil in those sediments. But as I said before, Noah could have still been in the mountains of Ararat while that was happening down there in the Mesopotamian basin. But massive coal beds formed in the Paleogene. And so how does that fit with the post-flood boundary? So you can see there's a lot of issues that we geologists have to discuss amongst ourselves and reconcile. There have been strongly held arguments, but we need to come to a consensus. Why? As I said before, it's important for the archaeologists and the biologists so they can start working on the early part of the post-flood era. Help us understand that. Flood strata. Well, I think we've done our homework well in that area because it's now well established that the ocean waters cover the continents. No question about it, because you see, we can, the oil geologists help us with this in drawing these sea level curves from patterns of sedimentation, and we can see that there's evidence that the ocean waters flooded over the continents backwards and forwards, eroding with surges as a result of tsunamis, as the global tides of the flood. Marine deposits, of course, across the continent with marine fossils, and so we find marine fossils even near the top of Mount Everest. And the reason I say to people is, well, because if Everest was formed by the flood, it wasn't there before the flood, so you didn't need to cover Mount Everest with floodwaters. Okay? We've got sedimentation of megasequences of such layers across all the continents can be correlated globally. That's been well documented, and so we've got these megasequences that we can study right around the globe and correlate from continent to continent, which is exactly what you'd expect. Global scale sedimentation for a global flood cataclysm. And we can demonstrate that these were rapidly deposited because it requires catastrophic and rapid burial to preserve the fossils in all these graveyards. That's a given. You need catastrophic burial. And so the Topete sandstone, for example, in the Grand Canyon, these are layers that can be traced, as I said before, across the globe. The Great Unconformity is just below the Topete sandstone as you go into the Inner Gorge. That sandstone can be traced across North America, Africa, and into southern Israel, and as I said before, into eastern China and South Korea. And there it is, Solomon's Pillars at Timnah in southern Israel, and here's the outcrops in South Korea. And we see evidence of rapid deposition of whole sequences of such layers by the repeated tidal and tsunami-driven surges. And so, for example, we're going to talk about this in the documentary tomorrow afternoon. We can tie all the layers together that have to have been formed rapidly. The folding in the Grand Canyon is through the whole strata sequence, but the evidence indicates that the folding happened when the layers were still soft very soon after deposition. Within a year of deposition, not after 450 million years. Otherwise, they would have crumbled and broken And so these are folded, and we're going to talk more about that tomorrow afternoon and come back with a documentary. It requires a whole strata sequence deposited very rapidly, and all of this is being driven by catastrophic plate tectonics. So we've done a lot of good work in that area. And there's the diagram of catastrophic plate tectonics that drove the flood. What about the pre-flood and creation week? We really haven't grappled with what the geology was like back there. What was the geology of the pre-flood world? Most of the North American geologists don't really appreciate the thickness and extent of Precambrian rock layers. This diagram again shows the vastness of the Precambrian. The 70% of the geological record, at least, is Precambrian. And so if we're only talking about the flood and its aftermath in the 30%, what about the other 70% of the rock layers? And these Precambrian cratons are on every continent, and they're very thick and extensive, and the colouring doesn't show up too well there. But 2/3 of the Australian continent is Precambrian. And these rocks give what appears to be a long apparent history of sedimentation, metamorphism, volcanism and plutonism. That's what appears to be the case, okay? In conventional wisdom, that means millions and millions and billions of years actually of cycles. Here's the Pilbara crater in northwestern Australia, which, as you can see, it's a very complex geology. You've got granite plutons surrounded by greenstone belts and sediment layers, which represents a huge amount of deposition. In fact, we can go from the Pilbara and from different basins, Precambrian basins in Australia, we can measure the Precambrian sedimentary layers in terms of miles of thickness. So how do we explain all that in the terms of the biblical record? Another thing is the Precambrian has unique different rock layers. Rock layers and rock types that are only found in Precambrian strata. For example, banded iron formations, where we get all the iron ore for our steel. Here they are in Western Australia. And they're only found in the Precambrian primarily. Why is it that they're only found in that era? Well, obviously God provided it when He created it, but we only find them there in that era. What about Commodities? You probably haven't heard of that term, but that's a high temperature basalt with a lot of olivine, which is a mineral that's found in the mantle. And these Commodities are only found in the Precambrian, and they have a unique, interesting texture. And you can see their abundance goes back, this diagram, from left to right, 0 to 4 billion. You can see how prevalent they are in the Precambrian. What about the granitic rocks? There are unique granitic rocks in the Precambrian. They're called tonalites, trogenites and granodiorites. And this is an outcrop of these rocks in China, and this is what they look like. And they're unique. In fact, these are only found in the earliest Precambrian. Later in the Precambrian, the chemistry of these rocks change. And stromatolites, these unique fossils of cyanobacteria that built mats, that built domes and structures that probably existed in the pre-flood world and got obliterated during the flood. These are stromatolites in the eastern Grand Canyon. And you can see abundance. They are hugely abundant in the Precambrian, and then they suddenly disappear when the flood begins. And so this is another area of uniqueness. So the Precambrian needs to be understood. And there's some relevant biblical considerations here, okay? Day one, the earth was created. Was there an initial crust? Probably. We argued that in the rate project, that the core mantle boundary, the core mantle crust structure had already been formed. Day two, we have the separation of the waters. Was there sedimentation on the ocean floor already? Day three, we have the separation and uplift of the dry land with massive tectonics, volcanism, plutonism, metamorphism, erosion and sedimentation. Don't forget, when God uplifted the dry land, as it breached the water surface, it would drain off and it would erode. And so we would expect sedimentation during the creation week. But of course, by the time we get to day 4, everything has to subside, because now God's going to clothe the continents, with the supercontinent, with vegetation and start putting life on it, and it needs to be conducive for life. But sedimentation might have continued on the pre-flood ocean floor. And it would have continued into the pre-flood era, though erosion and fossilisation would only been slow, and fossilisation of microscopic life and stromatolites. So we also need to remember that creation ex nihilo is instant and results in complex, mature products without any prior history. So, for example, Jesus turned water into wine. Wine that normally we'd think of as having a complex history. We need to do away with the term of appearance of age. God created a fully formed, fully functional, mature universe. We impose the age on it. We interpret it as having an apparent history. The rocks that we see today are not in the condition which God created them, because they've suffered from subsequent events. So we cannot show you what the rocks were like when God created them. But we can establish what rocks go back to the creation week, because the flood rocks are built on that foundation. So we have to take these issues into account. And as I said, they're not today's rocks, Precambrian rocks, are not necessarily the condition in which God created them. So we need to do a lot more work on the Precambrian. What about coal and oil? Well, it's now well established that coal beds were formed by floating mats of vegetation during the flood, and that's been well established, and it's a very powerful explanation from coal beds. And of course we can show that it was turned from, the vegetation was rapidly turned into coal. You know, experiments have been done in the secular literature to show how this can be done in weeks. And it's well known that you can turn vegetation into coal that mimics natural coal. What about oil? Well, massive marine algal blooms were rapidly deposited in shales and limestones during the flood. Pressure temperature changes, hydrothermal fluids affecting those rocks, and also coal beds would have rapidly generated oil and it migrated. So we've done a fairly good job, and we can do a very good defence on issues like coal and oil as they've been produced during the flood, and also continue even after the flood. You can still have oil being generated in the early flood period. So there's a lot of good work being done. Hydrothermal origin of oil, for example. What about limestones and diatomites? Well, we can show that some limestone beds can accumulate rapidly, like these chalk beds. Don't forget that the chalk beds in Kansas also bury dinosaurs, birds, and pliosaurs and turtles. Chalk can't form slowly to bury those sorts of creatures that are up to 15 and 18 feet long. It has to be very rapid. And so here's the English chalk with the microscopic coccolithophores, but here's one of the fossils in the chalk in Kansas, the same chalk layers. How do you get a fish like that fossilised slowly with fraction of an inch per 1,000 years to sedimentation accumulation of chalk? It doesn't work. So we can demonstrate that chalk, the type of limestone, accumulates rapidly. And many limestones, one of the things I found in the research in the Grand Canyon, even the limestones contain a lot of silicate minerals. They're not pure carbonate rocks. The dolomites, they've similarly been found to bury huge whale fossils. We find that in the Monterey, in California. We also find it down in the Pisco Formation in Peru. Okay? To bury huge whales requires rapid sedimentation. Also, some of the trace elements in these carbonate rocks indicate that the deposition was from hot waters, which you find during the flood. What about precipitates and evaporites? Okay, salt-type deposits. Traditionally they've been claimed to have been by evaporation, and we call them now precipitites because we believe that they are precipitate. Here's some salt beds in Eritrea. How do we explain these huge peak salt beds in some places. Well, as I said, there's suggestions that you've had hydrothermal brines or supercritical water, that they're being precipitated from them rapidly, or some are even suggesting salt magmas. And we need to do more work in this area. Here's some experiments that were done in producing salt deposits from hydrothermal brines. And so neither model has been well established and become fully viable, so we need a lot more work done on that. We need to look at the aqueous geochemistry, the thermodynamics of some of these salts as they relate to temperature and pressure. So we can do numerical simulations using the molecular dynamics, for example, and I know of some who are working in these areas and some that are discussed at this conference. What about regional metamorphism? This needs further investigation. And regional metamorphic complexes cover huge areas, okay? And they claim to take millions of years of increasing pressures and temperatures. And so, for example, you drive from Gatlinburg across to Cherokee through the Great Smoky Mountains, you're actually going through zones of regional metamorphism. Some progress has been made in this area where different clay minerals under pressure, under hydrothermal fluids will mimic the zonation. And some of that work needs to be further continued. Moving on quickly, granites. It's now been established that many granites intrude flood sediments, so they have to form within the flood year. So, for example, the granites in the Yosemite Valley. Even the conventional geologists recognise that granite plutons can form rapidly, even conventionally, by sequential filling and thickening, by dike transport into large domal structures called laccoliths. And that overcomes the space problem that many geologists argued about for years. And so the idea is that you have little bits of melting at the bottom of the crust, or near the bottom of the crust, and under pressure they get squeezed up through dikes, and they accumulate into these big bodies called plutons that we can see in thickness, and this is all documented in the conventional literature, by the way. And cooling. We've been able to demonstrate that cooling and crystallization can be accelerated by hydrothermal fluid convection from the magma out into the country rocks through a cracking front. And so the fluids will help carry the heat out into the surrounding country rocks. And so we're getting closer and closer to a very good explanation for granites during the flood year. And I'm nearly finished, by the way. Also looking at polonium radiohalogens, they can confirm that crystallization had to be rapid. And so this is some of the work that I've been involved in, and you can read more of that. Finally, three more. Metallic ore deposits. Okay, we need to investigate. Many ore deposits formed due to a variety of geological processes during the flood. So that means they have formed rapidly. So, for example, just near Salt Lake City, you've got the huge Bingham Canyon copper gold mine. Many of these depositors are associated with granite plutons. So granites forming rapidly during the flood help us to explain those deposits and all other sorts of deposits associated with them, gold vein deposits, and so forth. But there are patterns of occurrence of metal deposits that would give us clues, and I've talked about this for a long time. Because, for example, you can see patterns here. A lot of deposits go back to the creation week and pre-flood. Only some deposits formed during the flood. So we've got a lot of homework still to do in the area of ore deposits because they drive the technology that we enjoy today. What about radioisotope dating? This is the second last one. You know, you might think that it's been, well, for starters, we've established that the assumptions in the dating methods can be sometimes violated because they produce erroneous dates due to inheritance and contamination. So, for example, here in the Western Grand Canyon, we've got lava flows that are so recent they block the Colorado River, and yet they give the same rubidium strontium age as the oldest lava flows in the Grand Canyon. In other words, the radioisotope date is actually the radioisotope chemistry of the source. It's not the age of the rock. It's inherited from its mantle source. We know that heat and water can perturb. So, for example, a granite intruding into these Precambrian metamorphic rocks, we find the age changes, so the ages decrease closer to the granite because of the effect of the heat and water. So we're well established even from the secular literature. We also have demonstrated accelerated radioactive decay during a past catastrophic event can explain the systematic pattern of inflated radioisotope ages upwards through the geologic record. For example, a volcanic rock formed in the first 12 months of the flood will have 12 months of accumulated rapid accelerated decay products, whereas a layer formed in the last month of the flood only has 1 month of accelerated radioactive decay products. And so it will give a younger age. So that makes a lot of sense. However, what about the so-called age of the Earth and the vast Precambrian ages? You know, most people don't realise that the age of the Earth was established on meteorites, not on Earth rocks. Why is it the meteorites all give the same age as the Earth? Well, they were created at the same time during creation week, or very, within days. What about the issue of potentially having a lot of accelerated decay during the creation week? So the first 2.5 days. You know, I still am torn by the theology of that. We need to understand that maybe there's something else going on. Wouldn't God create, if he made rocky planets like the Earth and rocky meteorites from asteroids that are rocky like the Earth, would they also have an initial composition that included many of these daughter products that didn't come from radioisotope decay? And so that's part of the primordial composition of the material that God used, and that's why the meteorites give the same age as the Earth. So we've got to think about these issues. It might not be just simply due to accelerated radioactive decay. So we need more research to build a comprehensive model of the history of radioisotopes through Earth history. Finally, cratering, and this is going to be discussed at this conference. Certainly, there are lots of meteorite impacts during the flood, and they likely triggered the flood and what was going on during the flood. And so, there's been lots of these craters found that correlate with flood rocks. We can even find in Sweden, in a limestone quarry, where there was a meteorite fall fossilised. So that's another argument that limestones form rapidly. Okay? So we've got recent meteorite craters that are still on the post-flood Earth. This is the post-flood surface of the Earth. But we've also got impacts that are supposedly dated at Precambrian. How do we deal with those? Well, some have suggested and also the rocky planets, asteroids, in the other bodies of the solar system have meteorite impacts. The Moon, Mercury, Phoebus, Martian moon Phoebus, the asteroid 4 Vesta, they all have craters. Now, some have suggested that there might have been cratering during the creation week. But is that theologically compatible with a very good Earth? I don't know, we need to argue that. We need to come up with understanding the cratering record through the solar system. So much more research needs to be done. So, in conclusion, we've made much progress towards building a comprehensive flood model that can be used with confidence in defending the biblical flood account. However, debate and research must continue to resolve crucial issues such as the flood post-flood boundary and the formation of precipitites, salt beds for example. Continuing research needs to be done on geological processes during the flood, such as the rapid deposition of strata and their correlation across the globe, regional metamorphism, granite formation of ore deposits. We need to work on to resolve the vast Precambrian record within the the biblical record. Where does it all fit and how do we understand it, and more deposits that it contains. We need to do a lot more work in building a comprehensive model of radioisotope dates, what they mean, what they reflect, for the history of radioactive decay that is biblically compatible, and also with the cratering record. We need to understand how that fits with the biblical record. So we need to pray and work towards raising up a new generation. See, some of us are getting grey hairs and white hairs, and we need those to hand over. We need a new generation of creation geologists who are going to be dedicated to working on these issues. So thank you very much. You've been very patient.